Traditional Irish music, or trad as we fondly call it, is celebrated all over the world these days. But for most of its history, this music was, well, nearly gone. It was always on the brink, never guaranteed to stick around. It's a gripping story full of twists, silent printing presses, a devastating famine, a Chicago police chief, and a rescue mission thanks to technology that spans centuries and continents. To properly get our heads around just how delicate this music once was, we need to go right back to the very start. Picture a small stone cottage centuries ago on a blustery Irish hillside. Back then, Irish traditional music wasn't written down. There were no sheet music or tune books. Every jig, reel and air lived in people's minds, passed purely by ear from one generation to the next. Now, it was a very beautiful way for culture to keep going, but it was also terribly fragile. Just think of it for a second. If a great fiddle player or a famous piper even passed away suddenly, without someone to teach their tunes to, their whole musical world, all those unique melodies and fancy bits, just disappeared into thin air. It was a chain of memories, and even if one snapped, a bit of Ireland's very soul was gone for good. And because people didn't travel much beyond their own valleys back then, this way of learning by ear also meant that every area had its own wild, lovely musical style all over the island. If you were to walk from the rugged cliffs of County Donegal in the far northwest, right down to the green hilly Sliabh region in the southwest, you'd feel like you've stepped into a different country altogether. But now, if you're anything like me, you're probably looking at that fragile way of keeping music alive, all in people's heads, and wondering, why didn't they just write the whole lot down? I mean, Johannes Gutenberg invented those movable metal types and mains way back in the middle of the 1440s, and that technology spread like wildfire across Europe, changing literature, science and religion forever. Yet it took nearly 300 years for the printing press to even touch Irish traditional music. Why such a massive hold-up? Well, first off, there was a big technical problem. Printing musical notes was an absolute nightmare, structurally speaking anyway. Early printers had to somehow get both the musical staff and the notes onto one page. That meant they had to run the paper through a manual press up to 3 separate times. Once for the lines, once for the notes, and then again for any text. It needed incredible precision, you see. A tiny slip of the paper and the notes would just slide off the staff, making the music completely unplayable. The type itself needed a secret mix of metal alloys that early German master printers guarded like it was gold. On top of all of that, paper was shockingly expensive. When the first printing press finally crawled its way into Ireland in 1550, brought by an English printer called Humphrey Powell with a £20 grant from the British court, the financial strain was immense. Powell was constantly on the verge of going bust, even ending up in court for not paying for 100 reams of paper. But a second reason, and a far more troubling one for this delay, was all about politics. In Ireland, the printing press wasn't for letting people say what they wanted. It was a tool for taking over. Powell's press was paid for by the Crown to print government announcements and Protestant religious books, like the Book of the Common Prayer in 1551. All of this was to prop up English rule and the religious ways. By 1604, King James I had given a huge, complete monopoly to the King's printer in Ireland, a man named John Frankton. Under this monopoly, it was strictly against the law for anyone else to run a printing press or publish books in Ireland. This total control stayed in place through different owners for over 100 years. Because the ruling powers kept the presses locked down for official government and religious use, the native Irish people, who were mostly Catholic, had no way at all to use printing technology, and their music was seen as rebellious. The printing press, which should have been a lifeline, actually came like a cage, keeping Irish music stuck in the shadows of oral memory. But as the 1700s came along, things started to change a little bit. In 1724, a father and son, John and William Neal, who had a music shop in Dublin's Christchurch Yard, decided to get around the old rules. They published a collection of the most celebrated Irish tunes. This was the very first time in history that Irish traditional tunes were put down in print. The Neals even got an Italian violinist named Lorenzo Bacchi, who'd moved to Dublin to arrange some of the tunes in a popular Italian art music style. Bacchi took traditional melodies like the harp tune O'Rourke's Feast and improved them with classical divisions and a bass line. It was a strange yet lovely mix, really. The wild ancient melodies of the Gaelic harpers caught in time by the formal, elegant link of the Italian Baroque. Around that same time, the streets of Irish towns started to fill with the sounds of broadside ballads. These were cheap penny sheets printed on one side of rough paper. You'd buy them from travelling salesmen and peddlers at fairs, in the pubs and on street corners. They didn't print the actual sheet music. Notes were still too dear to print, but they gave people the words to songs about the day's news, love stories and political anthems. And at the top, they'd suggest a well-known traditional tune to sing them to. It was a clever, simple way of keeping the old melodies doing the rounds among ordinary folk. And then in 1845, disaster struck. The Great Famine hit Ireland. The potato blight didn't just ruin a crop, it absolutely tore Irish society to shreds. Over 1 million people died from starvation and sickness, and another 1 million fled the country on overcrowded, desperate ships. The very people who had kept the oral tradition alive, the rural cottiers, the local pipers and the singers by the fire, they were wiped out. As society fell apart, a group of dedicated historians and collectors realised that if they didn't do something right away, Ireland's entire musical heritage would be buried in mass graves. So from what we've seen in other videos that I've done before, these songs had lived on with the immigrants in other countries like the United States and Canada. The broadsides we talked about earlier were key to the song tradition in New Brunswick. Definitely check out this video here if you'd like to learn a little bit more about that. But in Ireland anyway, the forefront of this rescue mission had been led decades before by Edward Bunting, a classically trained organist from Belfast. In 1792, when he was just 19, Bunting was hired to write down the music played at the Belfast Harp Festival. He sat there before the last of the great harpers who carried the oral tradition, like 97-year-old Dennis Hempson. Bunting spent the rest of his days travelling to the wilder parts of Derry, Tyrone and Connacht, writing down tunes directly from the country folk. Now, because Bunting had that classical training, he had a bit of a blind spot, you see. He didn't quite grasp the unique modal scales of Irish music, so he'd correct them to fit classical rules, printing piano arrangements in keys that the harp just couldn't play. But even with his classical leanings, his books in 1796, 1809 and 1840 saved hundreds of tunes from vanishing forever. During the darkest years of the famine, others took up the cause, most notably George Petrie. In 1851, Petrie helped set up the Society for the Preservation and Publication of Melodies of Ireland. Petrie worked frantically, gathering tunes from the country people in the wild, isolated mountain districts of Ireland. In 1851, he published his great work, The Ancient Music of Ireland, which included a hauntingly beautiful, untitled air sent to him by Jane Ross from Limavady. She had heard it played by an old traditional musician and noted it down. That tune, saved thanks to Petrie's press, would eventually become known all over the world as the London Derriere, which is the tune to which Danny Boy is set to. Now, just a quick shout out here to say that it's been a wee while since I mentioned anything on the shop side of things. Right now, I've put a 10% discount site-wide. This hat I've got on right now has literally been the best seller, with near 60 people or something like that having worn one around the world somewhere. Honestly, a day is going to come where I see somebody wearing one. So if that's you and I end up walking to you on the street, please don't be alarmed. But I felt like I needed a little bit of a change too, so I designed a new one recently. It's very simple, minimalistic. It's just the channel logo, embroidered on black. Mine's on the way in the post now, so if you like the look of it yourself, sure, go on and grab one with the discount as well. But anyway, thanks for listening to that, and sure, let's just get back right into the video. And this is the point where our story crosses the Atlantic and the heart of the Irish musical world begins to shift. While the collectors back in Ireland were frantically trying to save a dying culture, the millions of Irish immigrants landing in the packed tenements of New York, Boston and Chicago were busy keeping it vibrant. They may have carried little luggage, but they certainly carried their tunes. And in these massive American cities, something truly amazing happened. Musicians from Donegal, Galway, Clare and Kerry, wherever, right? Folk who would have lived and died in complete isolation back home were suddenly all living side by side in the same neighbourhoods. A huge, lively urban mix of music started to bubble away, and then onto the stage steps Captain Francis O'Neill. O'Neill's life story is like something out of an adventure novel, I tell you. Born in Trallabane, West Cork in 1849, he grew up surrounded by singers and pipers. He learned to play the wooden flute by ear, had an incredible memory for melodies, and ran off to sea as a teenager. He survived a shipwreck, fended off wild animals, travelled the world, and eventually ended up in Chicago. There he joined the police force in 1873. By 1901, he had risen through the ranks and became the chief of the Chicago Police Department, leading the force during one of the city's most turbulent times. O'Neill was a man of great honesty and strong morals. Contrary to some of the tall tales, he had never bent his professional rules to offer special jobs to musicians just to put a band together. However, he was truly passionate about the music, and he actively surrounded himself with a brilliant circle of traditional players who also joined the force. He had realised that the older immigrant population of Chicago held a priceless, unwritten library of Irish music in their collective memories. He decided there and then to write it all down. Because O'Neill could play beautifully, but couldn't read or write sheet music, he found his perfect partner in Sergeant James O'Neill, a Belfast-born officer on the force who had a proper classical music education. The process was simple, but absolutely brilliant. The chief would travel around the city, humming or playing a tune on his flute that he'd collected from a patrolman or an immigrant in a local pub, and Sergeant James would write it down on manuscript paper. This monumental effort came to fruition in 1903 with the publication of The Music of Ireland, an absolute powerhouse containing 1,800 tunes. That was followed in 1907 by The Dance Music of Ireland, featuring 1,001 dance tunes. O'Neill didn't just print a book. He created a global blueprint. By using the high-speed printing presses of industrial Chicago, O'Neill did what 300 years of history in Ireland had failed to do. He gave the music a standard form. He took broken regional fading tunes, tidied them up, and printed them in a massive, affordable, easy-to-get book that was shipped back to Ireland and sent all over the world. Now let's bring this journey right up to today. Now no joke, right, as I even have the bandages to prove it. Now as I've mentioned before, I live in Japan, but last week had to have a little bit of surgery done. So there I was lying on the surgeon's table, and very nicely the doctor asked me what did I want to listen to, and I said, "Aidu dandu no ongaku," which roughly translates to "stick on a bit of trad." But as the playlist progressed, a bit of Anya played, but the funniest of all, Riverdance was the very last one to come on as I was sitting up off the table. The arm was limp from the anaesthetic, and the surgeon told me that her and her brother had went to see Riverdance in Osaka a good while back, and they absolutely loved it. Now I know Riverdance is a more modern, commercial mutation of music and dance, right? But it still came on from that knock-on effect of preserving the music, engaging with it, changing it, bringing it to the worldwide world. So I just thought that was pretty cool. And I don't know, maybe I have Francis O'Neill to thank for that fun and strange encounter. But moving on anyway. Next time you step into a cozy pub like maybe the Cobblestone in Dublin, or a local spot even in Boston and San Francisco, take a look at the musicians gathered in the corner. They're obviously playing what we call today as a session, but let's just remember this, right? For nearly all of Irish history, this was not a thing. Traditional music was a solo art form, usually played by one person. The modern pub session that we know of today, where loads of instruments play the exact same melody in perfect driving unison, is a direct result of that print standardization started by Francis O'Neill. Because of that Chicago printing press, a flute player from Tokyo, a fiddler from New York, and an uilleann piper from Dublin can walk into a pub anywhere in the world today, sit down and play the exact same version of a 300-year-old tune without having met before. The printing press itself turned a local oral tradition into a language that everybody could understand. But today, that print revolution has moved on to something more digital. The old paper books have become the digital heart. We now have the Irish Traditional Music Archive in Dublin, which is a top-notch digital preservation partnership that archives websites, recordings and manuscripts, making sure that no tune will ever be lost again. We've got crowdsourced websites like thesession.org, where a global community of musicians has uploaded over 11,000 tunes in ABC notation. You've got trad chords as well, allowing the community to build intricate chord progressions on top of these tunes. And there's TunePal as well, which now I haven't used myself, so maybe you can let me know if it's even good, but apparently it's like you hold your phone up and let it listen to the tune and it will tell you what tune is being played. But I know with a lot of these apps that it can still be very inaccurate in a lot of cases. But it all goes back to this. Let's always remember that the musicians and teachers hundreds of years ago, keeping these tunes going without even being able to write them down, to the printers as well then after that who were brave enough to go against the law, to the collectors who worked against the clock during the famine, and to a Chicago police chief who wrote down the very soundtrack of an exiled nation, and to all of you too, for being such a massive part of the Irish music community. Whether you know it or not, no matter how you learn or how often you play, you are just like those 100-year-old musicians from a long time ago. You are all a huge part of the global music tradition.